Welcome back, social media friends. Today I'm here to read to you first couple chapters of the book that I'm reading, and it's called Punch Me Up to the Gods, a memoir. Brian Broome. Now, I've never heard of this author before, um, but I really, memoirs and biographies and autobiographies are, if I had to pick a favorite genre of book, that's what I'm picking. I went through a phase in my 20s where, like, I swear to God, 9 out of 10 books I read were of this variety. And I'll read a brief snippet from the back just to give you an idea. Brian Broome's early years growing up in Ohio as a dark-skinned black boy harboring crushes on other boys propel forward this, quote, devastatingly beautiful memoir. Broome's recounting of his experiences in all their cringe-worthy, hilarious, and heartbreaking glory reveal a perpetual outsider trying to learn to be a man in a place, in a family, in a community where everything he is seems to run counter to everything he's supposed to be. I can relate. And I also wanted to say to all my friends out there, all 60 something of you, it is important, most of you are the same skin color as me. It is very important for you to read books written by people who have different color skin than you. It's not enough to like scroll through a meme on social media or read a news article about race relations and progress or non-progress or even, the undoing of progress. It's not enough. And I know a lot of you, I could challenge you to, do you have any black friends? When's the last time you shared a meal with somebody that has a different skin color than you? My test was I would just always tell people, pick up your phone and call a black person right now, and ask them, prove it to me. Tell me, show me that you are not, limiting your social interactions, even subconsciously. Not, you don't even know that you are, or maybe you're brought up in such a place or an environment, and that you don't have the opportunity to make friends that don't look exactly like you. The first book I read, written by a black author, was called Black Boy by Richard Wright. I read it in 6th grade, and I distinctly remember my teacher trying to take it from me. I'm not sure if I can remember exactly if she was trying to take it from me based on the subject matter of the book, or that I was always reading my own books in class. So teachers were always taking non-textbooks from me and putting them on their desk and telling me that I could get it after class was over. That happened to me many times. And in middle school, and definitely high school, teachers stopped caring, because I wasn't disrupting the class. and they had bigger fish to fry. So I was free to ignore class and get lost in my own books, in magazines, because I read fishing magazines at school too. Yeah. But anyway, uh, I'm here to implore you that the next time you pick up a book, if you haven't read a book written by someone of a different color than you, skin color than you, then, you know, if you'd like some insight, maybe, you know, give it a consideration. So here we go. Punch Me Up to the Gods. The Initiation of Tuan. I am standing at a bus stop in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, on the black end of town. It's a hot but overcast summer day. To my left is a young man mesmerized by his cell phone. He laughs out loud periodically while staring into its depths. Then his thumbs fly like hummingbird wings over the keyboard. He is dressed like all the other young men around here in the newest iteration of distressed jeans, with stark white tennis shoes and a shirt with a sports logo emblazoned across the front. I notice him only because a little boy wearing an almost identical outfit in miniature is circling around him and around his feet like a toy train. The toddler, who is doing all the things toddlers do with their newly found feet, pitches forward with full force onto the sidewalk. Enormous toddler head first. The women around me gasp, as so do I. Some of them take halting steps toward the boy. Pearls are clutched, while we wait for the young man, who I assume is the boy's father, to pick the boy up and tend to him. The boy's wails are high-pitched and ear-splitting. The child's name is Tuan. "Shake it off, Tuan," the young father says, glancing briefly down at the boy and then turning back to his phone. Tuan sits down on the sidewalk only to howl more loudly. The women around me shift their eyes from the child to the father and back again. Their worried looks are digging deep creases between their brows. They exchange disapproving glances with one another. The boy's screams are now rattling his voice box, and his mouth is open so wide that his little face appears to be tearing itself apart. As I watch the boy sitting on the sidewalk, I try to remember what real crying feels like. I can't. I can only remember the tactics I employed to try to suppress it. Tuan's father picks the boy up off the ground and places him on the bus stop bench before turning back to the flickering lights inside his phone. Tuan has no interest in shaking it off. "Be a man, Tuan," the boy's father says out of the corner of his mouth, eyes steady on the phone. Tuan has no interest in being a man, and his screaming continues. Tuan's father kneels down, grips the boy by the shoulders, and looks him straight in the eyes. "Stop crying, Tuan. Be a man, Tuan." When I was a boy, I used to sit on the back steps of our house after an ass whooping because afterward, I was always commanded not to leave our yard. My father would wander out after a long while with his head down and the same hands he'd used to just whoop my ass shoved deeply into his pockets. Instead of letting the screen door slam as he usually did, he would close it carefully. He knew that he had let his temper get the best of him, and so he would come out, weighed down by a remorse he was unable to express with words. He'd just sit down next to me and quietly look off into the distance. He'd fish out his packet of Winstons, place one between his lips, use both hands on his lighter to light it, and exhale a thick cloud of ivory smoke. For a little while, he and I would share a silence that was occasionally broken by my hiccuping sobs and sharp intakes of air. Sometimes he would come out bearing gifts, a popsicle, or a candy bar that he'd hand to me wordlessly while still looking out on the backyard, and we'd sit there until he couldn't take listening to my sopping wet whimpering any longer, and he'd command me suddenly, as if he'd just woken out of a dream. "Stop crying. You've done cried enough. Stop crying right now." I would stop immediately. As Tuan's father's voice becomes louder, demanding that the boy stop crying, all I want to do is pick the boy up to make sure he's all right. I can't explain it. Something to do with his tiny shoulders being held in a vice-like grip by the very person he needs tenderness from in this moment. Something about the unaddressed ache. And I realize that what I am witnessing, is the playing out of one of the very conditions that have dogged my entire existence. This, quote, being a man to the exclusion of all other things. As Tuan's father publicly chastises him for his tears, I remember how my own tears were seen as an affront. I remember how my father looked at me as if I was leaking gasoline and about to set the whole concept of black manhood on fire. Stop crying. Be a man. My father's beatings were like lightning strikes, powerful, fast, and unpredictable. He held his anger so tightly that, when it finally overtook him, the force was bone-shaking. He punched me like I was a grown-ass man. He went blind with rage and just punched with all his strength of a steelworker. It never took more than one to lay me on my back windless. Then he would dare me to get up. I never did. When he punched me in the stomach, my flesh engulfed his fist. When he caught me in the chest, I could swear I heard ribs crack. His punches to my head rocked it back on my shoulders so violently that I momentarily lost vision in one eye. This is how he meted out punishment for the offenses of not listening to him, for talking too slick, or for, quote, acting like a girl. I close my eyes at the memory and, in my mind, drop down to Tuan's perspective. I see things through his eyes. I am looking into the angry face of the man who will teach me how to be in the world. I cannot understand his words, but I can see his furrowed brow and feel his hands imploring me to stop feeling what I am most definitely feeling. Stop feeling fear and pain. Tuan's father is telling me to tuck it away somewhere where no one can see it. To be ashamed of it. It's the age-old conundrum. Black boys have to be tough, but in doing so, we must also sacrifice our sensitivity, our humanity. I can feel his urgency and know that my body has done something wrong. Tuan's wailing begins to subside, like a police siren fading into the distance until he is silent. When he is, his father stands up, turns away, and begins once again to gaze into his phone. But back on the bench, the boy's face is still contorted into a mask of pain and confusion. His lips are stretched out over his teeth, and no sound dares escape his mouth. His breath comes in short bursts. His whole body is occupied with the act of suppressing. Fist clenched, body taut, eyebrows knitted in total concentration, he sits this way until the bus arrives, and his father stands him on his feet. I board the bus behind them as I'm drawn back to my boyhood lessons in disaffectedness, nonchalance, and hollow strength. It was a never-ending performance that I could not keep up to save my life. And when I failed consistently, there was never any shortage of people around to punish me for it. We real cool. Oh, I wanted to read the poem that this author uses It's very short. Um, to name his the titles of the chapters. This is a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, and I read I remember a few years ago, but it don't leave you. It's very short. Here we go. It's called We Real Cool, and she's describing the pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel, which is probably a bar or something. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sling sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. So here's We Real Cool. And I guess this is the second chapter. This is the first chapter. This book is laid out differently. Like the chapters aren't numbered. There's 3 introductions. But anyway, who cares? Right? It's a memoir. You can write it any way you want. And I admire that. Whatever it was, I already knew by 10 years old that I didn't have it. I couldn't access it, couldn't summon it, couldn't fake it. But the boys all around me had it in spades, this elusive quality that only black boys could possess. White boys didn't have it. Whenever they tried to pretend that they did, it came off forced, stiff, and rehearsed. When they tried to be, quote, cool, you could see right through them. I didn't possess this quality either, and I knew of no way to make it come to me. It's a trait that defies verbiage, and the only thing I could understand about it at the time was that it seemed to involve an almost superhuman ability to lean on things. Up against buildings and telephone poles and cars, not giving a shit about the thing upon which you are leaning. Nor should you appear worried about that thing shifting under your weight to send you crashing to the ground. It seemed to hinge on the absolute belief that whatever you were casually leaning up against would support you, because you, after all, are you. I learned what white boys do and what black boys are supposed to do to counter it at the foot of the master, my best friend, Corey. When we were 10 years old, we sat in his bedroom after school surrounded by his baseball, basketball, and football equipment as he admonished me. The differences between black boys and white boys, he explained, are vast, and it is entirely up to the black boy to make these differences clear. White boys could just do whatever, but black boys had to show through our behavior that we were undeniably, incontrovertibly the most male, the toughest. We sat on either end of his bed, and I got lost in his pretty brown eyes as he explained that white boys were basically girls, pussies, and that there was nothing worse than a boy acting like a girl. I stared blankly, wanting to kiss him. According to him, the seemingly simple act of being white and male made one soft and a punk. But black boys were constructed of special stuff that made us stronger, colder, cooler. All I wanted to do was hold his hand. But I listened because he was beautiful. He was light-skinned with curly black hair and straight white teeth. He was the polar opposite of me, too dark-skinned with the teeth in my head crawling all over each other like they were trying to escape a house on fire. He talked on as I got lost in his face. White folks, he explained, won't let you do anything anyways. So you gotta show them. All they do is fuck with black folks all the time, so you gotta prove to them that you won't be fucked with right from the start. That's why white dudes be scared of us. Because they know that when it gets right down to it, we cooler. That's why they women always come for our dick. I didn't understand any of this, Corey explained that the rules were simple. There were girl things and there were boy things, and white boys liked girl things, and acting like a white boy or a girl of any color was prohibited. The list of girl things included studying, listening, being pussy whipped, and curiosity. There were categories and subcategories, but being pussy whipped was the worst of these transgressions. Corey explained that black boys were to always be in control of the girls. There were no gray areas, and each time I visited his home, he scolded me about how he'd heard I'd messed up that day at school. He never interacted with me in public. He called me white boy and doled out punishments for my behavior that were severe. He play punched me to toughen me up. Blows to the side of my head or in the arm that were so hard that I knew somewhere deep down inside that he didn't really like me at all. Our play wrestling moved from play to real rapidly, like a switch had been flipped inside him. He bloodied my nose many times. He split my lips against my crooked teeth and once locked me in a porta potty by eliciting the help of other boys to lean on the door from the outside. The injuries that I sustained from him were dismissed by the adults as a result of wrestling or playing like horses. He wasn't whooping my ass, really. He was pummeling the girl out of me. I took his disguised ass whoopings almost every day, believing that one day he would deliver the one punch that might change me. I didn't know where Corey's father was. It never came up, and something told me not to ask. He lived with his mother, and there were times when I wanted to tell on him, but she treated him as a crowned prince who could do no wrong, and the one time I tried, I was only asked accusingly, "Well, what did you do to him?" And then admonished for being a tattletale, which, as near as I could tell, was a girly attribute. The house was his. He had full dominion. He had all the new toys and his own stereo. His clothes seemed to be perpetually new. The denim of his blue jeans was always that rich, deep shade of royal blue, rolled up at the cuff to reveal the lighter shade of blue underneath. Unlike me and my old dingy clothes, Corey was always fresh and his clothes fit him perfectly. He treated his mother like a servant and talked to her in a brazen and dictatorial way. He once told her to shut up, and I was left awestruck as I waited in vain for her to go up beside his head like my mother would have with me. But all she did was shut up. I had never seen a black boy with such power. He was a force in his house. He had the biggest say-so. I wanted to be him. When I arrived at his house on Saturday, I let myself in and stomped the snow from my boots. That winter was especially brutal. I was sent to his house by my parents every weekend, and I mostly dreaded it. Whole days with him were a merciless trial. He was unpredictable, moody. He called me poor and ugly. I never felt good when I left his house, nursing a Corey-inflicted wound that I chose to hide from my parents later. But my father was concerned about how many girls I was playing with on a regular basis. I was sent to Corey as a form of therapy. My father loved him and would clap him on the back whenever he came around, and they would laugh. I wanted that from my father too, and believed that Corey could fix me. I didn't mind that much if every once in a while that fixing resulted in a fat lip. I knew that he was the epitome of cool. Everyone did. I was grateful that he was my friend, and for some reason, I felt he needed me as much as I needed him. After I stomped the snow from my boots, I removed my jacket, scarf, and hat, hung them on the coat rack by the front door. I walked down the hallway past the living room where his mother was in her seemingly perpetual position in a lounge chair, mindlessly doing crochet and staring at the television. "Hi, Brian." His mother said this vacantly and with no enthusiasm, not so much reacting to my arrival as she was to the sound of the door opening and closing. I walked to Corey's closed bedroom door and hesitated, listening to him doing some sort of karate on himself on the other side. I took a deep breath and knocked lightly twice. The door flew open. He didn't even give me time to step inside before he grabbed my elbow, pushing me backward toward the very rack upon which I had just hung my hat and coat. He was fully dressed to go out into the snow. I didn't want to go back out, but there was no time for argument. He was in a rush, seized by some sort of urgency. He explained to his mother quickly that we were going outside to play. He hissed, "Hurry up," at me from between clenched teeth, and his mother looked up absently from her crochet to the window at the blinding snow coming down in drifts and then back to us with the incredulity. I don't know how to pronounce that word. Incredulity? Incredulity? Frack. Incredulous, I know how that one. Okay. I wanted her to tell him that we couldn't go. But then her face went blank and she returned to the mess of yarn on her lap. When I was fully dressed again, Corey all but shoved me out the front door, and it was only when we were a safe distance from his house that he began to explain. "Everybody calling you white." "What? Who?" We were walking through the field behind his mother's house, and the snow was coming down so heavily that my face was already wet. Our footsteps were synchronized so that the deep snow under our feet crunched at the exact same time in a rhythm that made me feel as though he and I were actually friends. We headed toward the woods. The sky was the color of concrete, and the branches of the trees were stripped naked of their leaves and heavy with snow. When we were deep into the woods and surrounded by them on all sides, Corey again spoke. "Everybody. They say you act like a white boy and a fag, and I told them you don't. I stood up for you. But they don't believe me, so we're going to meet a girl." "What girl?" "Some girl. You gon' fuck her." Corey explained that a council of black boys in the neighborhood had met up, and the topic had turned to why I was coming to his house on weekends. They knew, and he didn't like that. Corey's honor was at stake. He now had skin in the game. They had discussed such subtopics as how I was basically a white boy and a punk, and how I had failed to display the proper balance of nonchalance and boisterousness appropriate for a boy. They discussed my cursed bookishness, my disinterest and ineptitude at sports, my inability to lean against buildings, telephone poles, and cars, and the fact that I played with girls. In short, I was just not cool. It had been suggested that, by having kept company with me, Corey was a faggot by association. This could not stand. And now I was being taken to go fuck some girl to prove that Corey had not been hanging out with a sissy. I was to prove that I was not an insult to my race and my gender. We marched through the snow until we arrived at the abandoned barn behind a neighbor's house. It was more of a garage, really, but had the look of an old barn that had fallen into disrepair. The pit of my belly was alive with fear and confusion. Corey walked in ahead of me. The inside of the barn was scarred by graffiti and smelled of hay and motor oil. Car parts were scattered around an old, rusting dinosaur of a truck. They were mostly older boys. They were throwing rusty nuts and bolts at one another and laughing until we walked in, and then they froze. Each face was expectant and grinning. This group of nappy-headed older boys I recognized from the neighborhood and from basketball courts and baseball diamonds that I had walked by quickly. There was only one face that I didn't recognize. I knew immediately that she was a project girl. In my experience, project girls always come in one of two flavors. rambunctious and loud, or withdrawn and silent. She seemed to be the latter, standing there impassively watching the boys behave like boys and wearing a pink jacket that was far too light for the weather. Her clothes were dingy apart from the hot pink of her wrap, and her hair was twisted into two haphazard cornrows at the very top of her head that had curled themselves upward, giving her the look of having antennae. She was buck-toothed and skinny, and her demeanor was at once bored and disassociated. She seemed resigned to what she had to do, and when she looked at me, her eyes fixed with the knowledge that I was to be the one this time. Her hooded jacket with the soiled white trim hung off one shoulder. She seemed older, maybe 11 or 12, wearing high-water jeans and a dirty yellow t-shirt. 5 boys surrounded her, each blowing plumes of steam from their mouths and noses. She just looked up at me and down like she was about to stamp my passport, unimpressed and barely interested. After she was done here, she would get whatever candy or potato chips these boys had promised her, and that was all she seemed interested in. Her nonchalance was an indication that she already knew boys were just something she had to endure in order to get ahead. She was already accustomed to the idea that in this life, much like a building or a telephone pole or a car, her purpose was to be leaned on by boys. Corey marched me toward her like he was giving away the bride, and the boys all circled around to get a better look. The barn fell silent for half a second. Y'all told me he was light-skinned. Her disappointment was total. The boys giggled, and there was another moment of silence. I had no idea what to do. I didn't know what was expected. Then Corey told her to take down her pants, and she did. They fell around her ankles, and then all the boys, in a chorus of slithering whispers, told me to take my dick out. Some of their voices hadn't changed yet, so I heard the command in different pitches, all insisting that I do it and do it now. I looked to see all their wide eyes trained lasciviously on my fly. Not good at that word either. The girl took my hand and slowly put it on her new and hard breast. I wanted to run. Everybody here knew what was supposed to be happening except for me, so I did what I was told. I undid my fly and belt, and my pants dropped to my ankles. The frigid air rinsed my legs. I slid my underwear down, and they hovered on my calves just above my trousers. No answers came to me. No instinct gripped me. My penis just hung there, stubby, dumb, useless, and getting cold. The girl was irritated. She stepped towards me, and I stood stock still, looking her directly in her distant eyes. She smelled like dirt and perfume. She arched her back a little, reached her arms around to grab my butt, and thrust the warmth of her thighs against mine, and then started to move her hips slowly, and the boys went wild and whisper shouting. She breathed hot into my ear. "This how," she said, and I just stood there, with my fingers clenched into fists at the end of my stiff arms, as she moved warm skin back and forth across my cold and oblivious penis. Each time she thrust her hips, the boys got louder and louder until the barn was alive with the echoes of catcalls from the mouths of boys who had just learned how to apply the word fuck practically. And then it was over. It was only over because she got tired of doing it. There had been minimal response from me. I tried to grab her by the shoulders to kiss her like I'd seen on TV. She blocked my hands, snatched her head away, and looked at me with a quizzical anger, as if I had tried to slap her across the face. The girl looked up at the boys, who were by this point bored and fully disappointed by my performance. She jerked away from me quickly and announced, "I gotta get home or I'm gonna be in trouble." Then she pulled up her pants, flipped the hood up on her coat, zipped it, and headed for the barn door, taking most of the boys with her. They all ran past me without a word as I stood there with my pants still around my ankles. So this was fucking. I felt sick. I knew that this was what my mother was talking about when she derided people for being nasty, and how I was such a person now. Corey turned around from giving his high fives to exiting boys as I was zipping up. He was silent for a moment. You didn't do it right. You're supposed to get it in there. You're supposed to get your dick in there. I didn't understand what he was talking about. When we exited the barn, I turned left to follow him back to his house. He stopped me. He told me that it wasn't cool that I didn't get it in there, and then he hit me with a punch in the chest so hard that I doubled over in pain. I could feel the resentment behind it. I could feel the hate. He turned abruptly and began to walk back toward the woods. I stood there for a while until he disappeared into them. I knew that I shouldn't try to visit him anymore. I walked slowly away from the barn toward my house, trying to think of lies to tell my father about why Corey and I weren't friends anymore. The snow began to fall faster, like rain. I felt the pain of his very last punch all the way back home.